One of my favorite slash least favorite things about being in New York is when I see people selling really ugly fake bags on the street. It's funny because sort of fake bags are like why I got into national security. And I mean that in a very literal sense. So the TLDR is that I was on vacation with my family. I was in high school and I was reading an article in Vanity Fair. There was actually two articles in Vanity Fair that I was reading. So I think it's probably around 2003, 2004. First, I read this article about a then former retired two-star in the U.S. Army named Paul Eaton, Major General Paul Eaton, who ended up speaking out against the war in Iraq. Fast forward 10 years, I ended up working for General Eaton. In fact, he and I went to Cuba together. He and I and some other retired senior military leaders went to Cuba together. So there was an article about that and kind of the implications for civil military relations in that issue of Vanity Fair. And there was also an article about counterfeit luxury goods being made by what I think you could delicately call slaves in New York City. It was a piece about how these counterfeit goods were being made by people brought to the US, often by Chinese organized criminal gangs, and like brought here in indentured servitude slash slavery, forced labor. They were trafficked into the country. And I grew up in New Jersey and outside of Philadelphia and like in the land of the flea markets. And like we all saw some counterfeit bags everywhere, right? Counterfeit everything. And I remember reading that piece and just thinking to myself, I love nice things, but this is too high a cost. I know that sounds silly, but it's really true. And ultimately, when I went to college and throughout college and for a little bit after graduation, I really thought I was going to go into corporate social responsibility for luxury consumer brands and move to DC for like a quick minute to take a break after undergrad and to be my best self to apply to a top MBA program, and started out as an intern in a national security organization, and the rest is history. But anyways, so being in New York, seeing these counterfeit bags on the streets, I feel like is a really good kind of summary of a lot of what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about sort of like a bookend or not a conclusion, but some food for thought on UNGA, Putin's supposed update or change to Russia's nuclear war doctrine, and some catfishing that happened in national security. And to me, like, this is very much somewhere between you get what you pay for and trust but verify. And if that's not the story of counterfeit bags, right? Like, what is? Like, do not indulge in the counterfeit bags because they're much more dangerous than you realize. And I think that's sort of the underlying theme of this. Like, do not engage in the counterfeit entities. They are much more dangerous than you realize. So first, I firmly believe that the UN is absolutely the worst form of global multilateralism on the planet, except for every other option, right? Like, it is the worst option except all the other available options. And the reason I say this, I think, is really two things. One, I was in an event and someone cited some data that I spent the rest of today chasing down to make sure that I could stand behind. And the data point they cited is that since 1946, since the UN Security Council was established and held its first meeting, 86% of conflicts brought before the UN Security Council did not develop into kinetic conflicts or war, right? So 86% of disagreements that came before the UN Security Council were handled without physical conflict. And that's a pretty good number, And it reminds me a lot of something that we say in kind of the national security world is like the majority of what we do is prevention, if we're lucky, right? And how do you prove a negative? How do you prove that something didn't happen? And somebody made the astute observation that this is true of the UN as well. And I think that's an important point because measuring the efficacy of something in which the impact of that institution should be nothingness is really hard, right? If not impossible. Am I saying that the entirety of the UN is as effective, efficient, impactful as the UN Security Council? No. Am I saying that the UN Security Council is the most impactful, impressive, efficient aspect of the UN. Absolutely not. All I'm saying is this one quantitative data point is important. I think we need to do a little more digging on how other kind of aspects of the UN are measured and tracked. I stand by my Real Housewives of New Jersey, Orange County, Salt Lake City et al. Comparison in terms of the actual functionality of the Security Council. But I think, unlike a counterfeit bag, the UN is pretty upfront about what it is, or maybe more importantly, what it isn't. This is not a clean sort of in-out burger type vibe, right? This is utter chaos. And I'm coming out of the UN a little kinder towards it, I guess. Do I believe in it 100,000%? No. The only things in this world that I believe in 100,000% are my dog, my manicure, and my significant other, and probably also my hair. But I believe in it more than I did, and I know that the other options available are utter trash. Like, they make counterfeit bags look delicious. So I'm going to stick with the UN on this one. Number 2, Putin's speech to the Russian Security Council. So Putin visited Mongolia, and there was a lot of hubbub about it because he has an indictment against him, for war crimes, and Mongolia did not arrest him. Putin, spoke at the Russian Security Council. I'm just going to say that, which is not the same as the UN Security Council. But Putin made a comment, made a declaration that any attacks on Russia with conventional weapons, including missiles, which, as a reminder, missiles can be defensive if you're Ukraine. What do I mean by that? I mean that there's a lot of conversation about should the West, particularly the US, provide Ukraine with the weapons needed to prevent Russia from firing missiles into Ukraine, right? So basically, Putin said that if that happens, if weapons are fired into Russia by a country, whether or not it has nuclear weapons, the country that's doing the firing, if it is aligned with a country that has nuclear weapons, Russia may very well use its nuclear weapons in response to the attack. That would be catastrophic, right? And what does this have to do with counterfeit bags? I mean, the way that Putin presents this is like he is on the defense, right? That this is an avoidable outcome. He is misrepresenting the shitty fake Gucci G's that are really just C's, right? Why am I saying that? Because NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its founding charter, which very clearly states its job, its function, is to protect and promote democracy, peace, and stability of its signatories. 31 member nations, unless Finland makes it 32, I gotta check. But if all these member countries, and there's Article 5, and Article 5 states that an attack against one is an attack against all, right? Like the ultimate girl's girl vibe. And there are countries in NATO, like the US, with nuclear weapons. So basically, what Putin has said is not that Russia is going to defend itself and will be pushed as a last resort to use nuclear weapons, something that has only happened in this world. Nuclear weapons have been used in war by one country and one country only, and that was the United States, in Japan at the end of World War II. But Putin is saying he will do that. He has no problem doing that if any nation aligned with the US or France or another nuclear power provides weapons or uses capabilities. I don't want to say weapons because I think it gives people the assumption that it's inherently on the attack and not necessarily on the defense, even though you can have defensive weaponry, that Russia is apparently likely to respond with nuclear force. That's not what nukes are for. What do I mean by that? Like, literally, nukes are not for Putin being uncomfortable in his own skin, right? Like, he could go to therapy. He is misrepresenting his goods right now and their purpose and their origin, much like counterfeit bags on the street. So do not be fooled by this. Do not be fooled by this somewhat carefully constructed counterfeit bag of an argument that's like, if you just leave us alone, we're not going to have a problem. But if you come at us, we're going to nuke you. Nobody's coming at Putin Putin's attacking other people, right? And that's really important to remember. So I think that is a nice segue into the third thing I want to talk about today, which is catfishing and national security. I talk about this a lot. I write about this a lot. I work on this a lot. I am not anti-catfishing and national security as much as I am very anti-counterfeit goods, as we discussed. There's a time and place for catfishing. I think it depends who's doing the catfishing and who's being catfished and what is the reason. For example, sometimes this gets called honeypotting. If I can trick a dictator into telling me things to help make the world a better, safer, more secure, more stable, more peaceful place, I'm going to do it, right? But so Thursday, September 27th, it was reported that senior Senator Ben Cardin was participating with his staff in a Zoom meeting with someone who purported to be the former foreign minister of Ukraine. And to a certain extent, thank God this happened to Cardin and not to somebody else. Because Cardin's been around the block and his spidey sense went off, right? Much like a discerning shopper at Bergdorf's. He knew the difference between the shitty Gucci fake G's that are C's on the sidewalk and the real deal. And basically what happened, what we know is that some questions were asked in a way that seemed really politically charged, and in fact harkened back to Putin's speech. Do you support sending/providing weapons to Ukraine to attack Russia? I think is how some of the questions were worded. And immediately Cardin and his staff were like, wait a minute, this doesn't feel right. This doesn't sound right. Now, we don't yet publicly know if the person pretending to be the former foreign minister of Ukraine was somebody with their camera off, pretending to be the voice. We don't know if it was someone in a physical disguise. We don't know if it was generative AI, also known as a deepfake. We don't know. And for right now, I think that's okay, because the second you add the words artificial intelligence to any of these conversations, people think that deception, aka catfishing, aka honeypotting, is entirely a tech problem. It absolutely isn't, friends. You look at the Revolutionary War, the American Revolutionary War, we've had spies since you didn't need a filter to lie to people. You didn't need counterfeit bags to make up your own version of the truth, even if no one believed you. I think this is a really helpful story. And again, thank goodness this occurred with somebody who caught it, right? Because most people don't. I think it's really important to talk about these instances. You may hear it referred to as social engineering, right? Which, again, to be very clear, it's counterfeiting, it's catfishing, it's honeypotting, it's espionage. It's all the same. Call it what you want. It is not inherently evil. It is inherently deceptive, but that doesn't make it inherently evil. And again, what was said in the interaction with Cardin and his staff harkened back to Putin's speech. And the reason I wanted to talk about these two things is really to say, look, whether you are the UN's biggest cheerleader, or not, is sort of irrelevant. Whether you think the UN is credible or not, your answer, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter. I mean, it does matter. But if you don't think it's credible, I encourage you to come up with another option. Because if you have one that's better, sign me up. But like I said, I think this is the absolute worst version of global multilateralism available on this planet or in this universe, except for everything else. Without forums like the UN, without formal channels of communication, we're all in for a really wild, counterfeit, socially engineered ride. And whether it's on the streets of New York or online or in an article in Vanity Fair, this stuff happens, and that inherently isn't the problem. It's how we respond to it. And if we don't have the ability to check in with friends, allies, partners, neighbors, and people we hate to verify the shitty fake Gucci bag is in fact a shitty fake Gucci bag. If we don't have the forum to do that, like at the UN, we're really screwed because we're not all Ben Cardin. So I hope that this sort of I don't know. Is it a silver lining? Is it something interesting to think about? That's entirely up to you.